Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look for items that belong to Canadian war heroes, from medals of honor to an impressive tea set. These items carry on a very impactful legacy. Gary Melville looks at a silver tea service that belonged to a Nova Scotian who found herself risking her life in Holland.
There were a few articles in newspapers here and there, but really there was no firm acknowledgement of her significance in the war effort until recently.
Andrew Moss looks at a discharge certificate belonging to a soldier who fought in the battle for Hill 70.
He participated in a battle which is known as Hill 70, one of the most important battles for Canada during the First World War. Some historians say it's even more important than Vimy Ridge.
Mark People looks at a logbook from a dam buster tasked with breaching a 200 million litre dam.
Floyd was in one of those Lancasters, and he took off with his crew, and they headed to do one of the most audacious missions up to that point throughout the war.
My name is Amanda Lightbody. I brought in Floyd Wiles' Dambuster's logbook, his mother's Silver Cross, his service medals, and his operational wings. Floyd is my great uncle, and my grandmother had a lot of these things, so I've been collecting these things all of my life.
Steel was integral to the war machine of every nation fighting in World War II. Take away your enemy's steel, and you take away his ability to manufacture weapons. To accomplish this, you need to destroy either the steel factories or the generating stations powering them. For the Allies in 1943, this meant taking out heavily defended hydroelectric dams in the industrial heartland of Germany. But how could the Royal Air Force get past the Nazi guns and get their bombs to the right spot beneath the water in the massive reservoirs? And at what cost? The story of the Dambusters and Operation Chastise is the stuff of controversy and of legend.
Welcome, Amanda, to the set, and welcome to the show. You brought some fantastic items today. Let's be honest about it. And I think certainly what we're going to see today is pretty special.
So this is the Floyd Wiles logbook. This is when he was in the Canadian service and when he became a dambuster. This is his LAC, this is his operational wings. When he died, the government of Canada sent his mother, the Mother's Silver Cross. And these are the medals that he was awarded for his service from the time he started in 1940 to the end in 1943. Floyd was one of 7 children, grew up in the country in Hants County, Nova Scotia. He always wanted to fly. And when the war started, that's exactly what he decided to do. He started in the reserves in 1940, but it wasn't until 1941 that he actually had been accepted to the Air Force. And he went across to England, and then he joined up with the British.
So, Matt, on the night of May 16th, 1943, a force of 19 Lancaster bombers left RAF Scampton.
Yes.
Floyd was in one of those Lancasters, and he took off with his crew, and they headed to do one of the most audacious missions up to that point throughout the war. Operation Chastise was one of the RAF's major missions of World War II. On the night of May 16, 1943, 19 Lancaster bombers in 3 waves attempted to destroy 4 dams in the Ruhr Valley of Germany. The intent was to knock the dams out because the power being supplied by those dams was feeding the German steel industry.
Their mission was to fly over the dam, drop a bomb that would bounce across the water, across the netting, protective netting, hit the dams, and then slide down to the bottom and breach them.
It's one of the legendary missions of the war, and Floyd, as being a Nova Scotian born and bred son, he was part of that, and the only Nova Scotian.
He is the only Nova Scotian, is correct, yes. And unfortunately, they went straight instead of turning, and when they did, they ended up crashing over a unmarked power pylon and crashed into a farmer's field.
And unfortunately, the entire crew was killed with the ensuing explosion and crash. So the successful aircraft that made it to breach the dams, they succeeded in breaching just 2 of them. And they lost 8 aircraft out of the original 19.
They did, 53 casualties in total.
So it was a fairly significant loss.
I've known about Floyd for, since I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. And I felt a connection as soon as I saw a picture of him in his uniform. I don't understand why, but he has been part of my life ever since then. And I feel very protective of him, I guess you could say. He was just an amazing person, honest, truthful, very smart. Even though his records, his education records, didn't always show it. Algebra was one of the strongest pursuits he had, but he always had a passion, and his passion was radios and flight. And it wasn't until 1940 that he decided he was going to sign up and try his luck at the Air Force. He really, really wanted to fly, and he did it. And by the end of it, he was soaring, literally soaring.
Well, and you couldn't get anything much higher than this sort of elite squadron, 617 Squadron, which he was part of at that point.
Yes.
And obviously flying on probably one of the most recognized missions of the RAF undertook in World War II.
Yes.
Floyd ultimately sacrificed his life for this raid, and the effect of bombing the dams was a major contributor to loss of life on the German side as well. There is two sides to this story, obviously.
There usually is when it comes to things like this. And the other side of this story is that there was a loss of German life, but not just German life for the residents that lived around the dams, but also for a group of Soviet women who were prisoners of war themselves. 400 of those women perished as well when the flooding happened. There was also a loss of animals, farms, so it was devastating all around as well on that side.
Because I think it unleashed about 200 million liters of water, I think, into the valleys. I mean, that was,
a lot.
even with the two breaches, it was a significant amount of water that you were funneling down that.
Yes, it was. Unfortunately, there is some controversy of how well this played out. Was this a success or not? But they were able to get the dams back up and running within a short period of time. It boosted the morale when morale was needed, and that usually comes at a cost.
So Amanda, this is a very significant legacy. It's a legacy of a major operational mission the RAF undertook. It's a story of a Nova Scotian going to war and ultimately paying the ultimate price for that service in the war. Ultimately, the legend of the Dam Busters continued on after the war, and a movie was made in 1955. And 617 Squadron exists in the modern RAF today, and its symbol is a dam wall being broken.
Floyd is an average Nova Scotian person. He grew up, he lived values that Nova Scotia had. He represented something that was pure and honest and truthful in his life, but he also sacrificed his life. He did something that was tremendously hard and challenging, and his story can be inspiring. He had a passion and a dream, and he was going to follow it no matter what. And we always need the stories like that to help us remind ourselves that we can still do things that we set our mind to do.
Coming up on Militaria.
Really, there was no firm acknowledgement of her significance in the war effort until recently. My name is Sandy Hiltz. I brought in a tea service and a selection of photographs that belong to Mona Parsons and were buried actually by her during the Second World War.
The Nazi invasion came as a surprise to the Dutch, who had maintained a policy of neutrality and hadn't engaged in a European war in more than a century. In fact, the Netherlands had stronger bonds with Germany than Britain. This betrayal fueled the rise of the Dutch resistance, which was organized by the Dutch Communist Party, churches, and various independent groups. Their activities included concealing thousands of Jews and Allied servicemen from the Nazis. Among those who risked execution by taking part in the resistance was Mona Parsons, a Nova Scotian nurse who performed as a chorus girl in the Ziegfeld Follies in New York. Just prior to the war, she had moved to Holland as the bride of a Dutch millionaire.
Sandy, welcome to Militaria, and thank you for bringing in these wonderful artifacts. Could you tell us what it is and what their significance are?
Absolutely. So we have a sterling silver tea service made in England that belonged to Mona Parsons. So we have the under tray, the coffee pot, hot water pot, teapot, creamer, and the sugar bowl.
And how did this come in your possession?
Well, Mona Parsons is a relative of ours, and it's sort of just come down through the generations. Mona Parsons was part of the Allied war effort in Nazi-occupied Holland. During the war, she and her husband, who was a wealthy Dutch businessman, harbored a downed British airman on their estate. And this actually was in that house, and as the Nazis were approaching, was buried to keep it safe.
Obviously, in my mind, the reason to do this was to keep this out of the Germans' hands, otherwise they'd never see it again.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
They felt, either her or her husband felt, that this was important enough to, package up and bury to keep out of the hands of the Germans. And having the faith that the war would end and it wouldn't be the Germans that won, and they'd be able to dig this back up and move on with their lives. So they obviously felt that they were going to survive as well. So Sandy, it seems that it's just been recent that Mona is actually being honored for what she did during the war. And I was wondering if you could tell us what has happened in recent years.
Absolutely. So in the mid-2000s, they did a Heritage Minute featuring Mona, and Heritage Day in Nova Scotia in 2018 was named in her honor. And they've actually erected a statue in Wolfville. And throughout the course of the years, there have even been a few little plays and so on, and local productions done about her experience during the war.
So she's gone from being known a bit in Nova Scotia to actually taking some prominence in Canadian history.
Absolutely. Over the course of her life, there were a few articles in newspapers here and there, but really there was no firm acknowledgement of her significance in the war effort until recently.
Right, and besides, of course, her effort with the resistance and harboring the pilots, she has the significance, and not that it's a wonderful thing, but she was the only female Canadian to have been held by the Germans during the Second World War.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Sandy, as a family member, what was your impression of Mona and her life?
She was always sort of regarded as, in some ways, a larger-than-life character. She had an immense personality, and she sort of was over the top in her way of dressing and manner of speech and everything. So she was a great character. And of course, amongst her being that wonderful character and a lot of fun, she was also always respected for her acts during the war.
So Mona made it back to the Netherlands, and then eventually her husband William made it back as well, so they both survived the war.
Yes, that's right. They returned to live on their estate, and I think very much went back to living how they did before the war. But it had taken a terrible toll on his health, and he only survived, 9 or so years after the war. She only spent at most a year or two in the Netherlands and then returned home.
And then when she got back here, that's when she met Harry Foster, I assume, and then remarried?
Yes, exactly. They married in '57, and then they lived in Chester for the remainder of their marriage. And then after he died, she moved back to Wolfville.
So Sandy, we spoke earlier about Mona's trial in which she was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, she obviously wasn't executed. Do you know anything about how that stay of execution occurred?
Yes, it's a really wonderful story. She really did it just through writing a letter, which I should imagine must have been fairly strongly worded and convincing. One of the senior Nazi officers in the area found her sentence commuted to life in prison.
What I understood, though, is that this general was also a friend or a social acquaintance of a friend of hers, so I think she used that sort of connection to leverage the pity for the lack
Right.
or compassion, I guess, and to commute the sentence, because the judge was very impressed at how she conducted herself during the trial and suggested to her that she do that.
Right, and of course that's what the Heritage Minute focuses on, is that moment in the courtroom, yeah.
So Mona was moved from various prisons, and they were more work camps than prisons. However, in one she was responsible for making fuses for bombs. In another one, she fabricated wings out of wood, and there was talk of how the splinters would get infected because, of course, they weren't fed properly and such. Is there any family lore that expands upon that?
Yes, so there's a really wonderful family story surrounding that, and it was at a time which she was directed to start knitting socks for the German soldiers. And the family story is that she began knitting knots into the bottom of the socks so that it would be uncomfortable when they were marching.
Oh, that's wonderful. It just goes on with the resistance movement. Every little bit made a difference. So Sandy, Where does this tea service reside in your family now?
So this resides actually on our sideboard, much as it did in Mona and Billy's house in Holland. The number of objects she was allowed to bring back with her after her husband died were limited because some of the other pieces went to other family members. So this was obviously a piece of significance to her.
Does it get any use?
No, it doesn't, I'm afraid. It's not the most practical thing for today's life.
So I assume that the future of this artifact is remaining on your sideboard?
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
And who gets to polish it?
That would oftentimes be me or my father. It's a group effort.
Well, thank you so much for bringing it in. I think it's a wonderful tie to Mona Parsons. It's actually something physical that we can actually see and touch, as opposed to just the stories about a wonderful woman. And thanks again for coming and bringing this into Militaria.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For me, the lessons we take away from this story is that everyone can resist. Everyone can do a little bit in order to make the enemy's life a little bit worse. And you don't have to be a general, you don't have to be a rifleman. You can do little things like Mona and knit that sock that's got that big honking knot in the bottom. You know, every little thing accomplishes something, and a whole bunch of little things is a big thing.
Coming up on Militaria.
He participated in a battle which is known as Hill 70, one of the most important battles for Canada during the First World War.
I'm Doug McEwen. I brought my grandfather William's World War I medals and letters that he had written to his mom, his sister, as well as a photograph of William and his older brother Norman after the war, after they were discharged.
More soldiers went home disfigured and disabled from the First World War than ever before in human conflict. Machine guns, tanks, and poison gas were all ferocious new weapons on the battlefields of Europe. Artillery, though, tore through flesh and bone to kill and maim more men than any other type of weapon. Advances in cannons and mortars enabled them to fire bigger projectiles farther and more frequently than in earlier wars. At the same time, thanks to new surgical techniques, soldiers survived injuries that previously would have killed them. Between 300,000 and 500,000 men from both sides suffered amputations. Returning home, they had to manage not just their physical wounds, but also their emotional trauma as a new population of disabled veterans.
Doug, welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
You've got an interesting grouping of material here. If we look right here, you have your British War Medal from the First World War, named to William McEwen of the 27th Battalion. We have the Victory Medal, also named to McEwen of the 27th Battalion. And we have a Pilgrimage Medal in the center here. Over here we have his dog tags, fiber dog tags, with his serial number, his religion, and name. Over here we have an interesting group of letters that was included with your material, along with his discharge certificate. And over here we have a picture of William with his older brother. Now these were written by William?
Yes.
And to who were they addressed?
To his mother, Annie McEwen.
Typical of the time period, a letter, of course, would take several weeks to get home. And this was an attachment to a lot of soldiers. They would receive letters and news of home, and it was comforting for a lot of soldiers, and they could write and discuss with their loved ones a little bit about their lives, within reason, of course. Right over here, we have a cover letter here that's opened by censor. So all the mail that would have come from overseas would have been looked at by censors, and any information that could be pertinent to the battle or discouraging things that were written were cut out of the letters back home. And this was to ensure that no vital information could get back home, or things that could, cause damage to the war effort, especially things that were very, very disturbing. What could you tell us about this individual?
Well, my grandfather was, at the time of the war, living in Selkirk, Manitoba.
And he was a farmer, is that correct?
Yes. Had just turned 15 years old. His brother Norman, who is 2 years older, had enlisted already. So he convinced his mother to allow him to enlist at 15, and because of his size and stature, nobody questioned it.
It would have been a chance for adventure, to see the world, but really most people that joined up had no understanding of how technology, caught up to warfare and the horrible nightmarish scenes that were awaiting them. Interestingly, he participated in a battle which is known as Hill 70. Hill 70 was one of the most important battles for Canada during the First World War. Some historians say it's even more important than Vimy Ridge. Currie, the Canadian General Currie, was asked by Haig, the British Commander-in-Chief of Forces in Europe, to take the town of Lens. Now, Lens was a fortified town that was wiped out by the Germans, and they had built up, bunkers and such to repel any forces. What Currie suggested to Haig was to take Hill 70, which was the heights overlooking the town and surrounding area. The battle actually begun on the 15th of August. They managed to take it within a couple of days, but that was really only the beginning of the battle. Now, your relative, he would have been wounded during one of the German counterattacks. He just didn't get a scratch. Tell us about his wound.
Well, he is likely a piece of shrapnel in his right arm. Going to the hospital locally there, then to London, and then they could not repair it, so they amputated his arm just below the shoulder. And he managed to do quite well despite losing an arm. He did quite well for himself after he returned. He was missing his right arm, but still managed to play golf, one-armed, quite well, far better than me. And in 1920, he started with the Canadian National Railways Telegraph Group.
His older brother, who also, I believe, was joined up with the 100th Battalion and then also served in the 27th, didn't fare as well.
No.
What can you tell us about his experience?
My understanding is that he was injured in Vimy Ridge and laid on the battlefield for 24 hours before they recovered him. He lost his leg, amputated his leg. When he came back, I have information from aunts that said, never the same, never the same. He swears all the time, drinks all the time, mad all the time. And they referred to it as shell shock, which...
That's correct. In those days, it was considered shell shock. Yeah, now we know a bit more about it.
Yeah.
We call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There were field hospitals, not far from the front, so there was a bit better survivability than battlefield wounds in the 19th century. However, bacteria from the mud that they lived in every single day when they were in the front lines, a lot of it was farmers' fields, there was tons of bacteria, manure. If a wound did get infected, often they would have to amputate to save a life. Doug, what are your plans for these medals?
I intend to pass them on to my son. Keep the family history with the family. And he has two sons that both have an interest. So hopefully it'll carry on.
It's great to see that it's staying in the family. To understand the sacrifice that some of our grandparents went through, great-grandparents, grandparents, to preserve the freedoms of our country. And how, they suffered horribly, but continued with their lives. And that's why some people refer them as the greatest generation.